The Ukrainians are in a bad way right now in Kursk, that they're
Yeah, very
encircled.
bad, right?
Can you tell us what's going on?
Yeah, okay. The Russians have been just slowly tightening the noose around Kursk. They've been chipping away at it. And it was very, very slow at first, but it's been accelerating over recent weeks, and especially in the last week or so. So there was clearly a growing crisis. I think starting a couple of weeks ago, it became clear that the Ukrainians, at least a couple of weeks ago, that the Ukrainians were in danger of finding themselves encircled in this small town of Suja, which is just across the border from Sumy Oblast in Ukraine. Yeah, Suja, so it was the largest of the towns that were captured by the Ukrainians in their Kursk offensive. And now we used to talk about there was there was the Kursk territory, the Kursk pocket, as it shrunk. And then recently you hear people starting to talk about the Suja pocket, because they were actually just drawing the noose. So it was almost just around Suja. And then they came in, they crossed, the Russians did, they crossed the border into Sumy. And the purpose was actually to cut off this one supply route that has been feeding the Ukrainian military, the soldiers that are there in Suja and in the surrounding villages. And I don't think they have taken physical control. Who knows? Because things are developing very rapidly. This morning I was looking at the reports. It's just like, oh, they've taken another, the situation is dire. And this is something the Ukrainians themselves are saying. The situation is dire. There may be up to 10,000 soldiers trapped. They may be entirely trapped. Already many were killed trying to escape. Again, same old story. The Ukrainians waited until too long. This was obviously something that was very important to Zelensky, and he devoted a huge amount of resources to try to hang on to Kursk. And he got a lot of, PR mileage out of it. It's never made military sense. But I could see it, it's like sometimes I'll go through the kind of mainstream media stories, and they would say that, look, the Ukrainians are still holding on to Kursk. Clearly, the Russians are weak. They can't, it's been, 6 months, and they still can't get them out of there. This just demonstrates the strength of the Ukrainians. Well, it doesn't. The thing is the way that the Ukrainians hang on to places is they keep on, when their forces get destroyed there, they keep on sending in reserves. And it used to be, I remember like in the first year of the conflict, the first year and a half or 2 years of the conflict, they had enough reserves so they could do that all along the line. So you would see, the Russians would just keep on pounding the Ukrainians. And as they would destroy another company, another battalion, another brigade, but then the Ukrainians would move in a new brigade, plug the hole, and then it would start all over again. So you saw very little movement along the front, but again, this is a war of attrition. The Ukrainians were using up their men and their equipment. And that's what happened, in really spectacular fashion in Suja, because at this point in the war, they don't have the reserves to plug the holes all along the line. So they were taking, elite units from different places, with terrible consequences, farther south in Donetsk. And, we've seen how the Russians have made some very, very important advances there, and kept on sending them up along with other reserves into Kursk, kept on feeding them in there. And the Russians kept on pounding them. And now they have essentially cut off the one supply line. So you have, maybe, again, we don't know exactly how many, maybe 10,000, maybe 7,000, who knows exactly what it is, that are just pretty much, entirely encircled. I don't think they've taken physical control of the road, but they're very close to it, and they have drones and artillery on it constantly. And there's just really no way to send supplies in or for those Ukrainian troops to get out. So it's a disaster, and it was a predictable disaster. I know that already some Western media outlets have claimed that, this is a consequence of Donald Trump's, decision to stop supplying equipment, or to cut off intelligence. And that's nonsense. First of all, the equipment cut off, you're not going to see the results of that for at least, several weeks, maybe even a few months. I don't know exactly, because there's already a lot of equipment in Ukraine. And we're talking about, equipment that was already going to take a couple months actually to make it to the front. So clearly that has nothing to do with it. And then the intelligence, we're talking about, we're not talking about long range missile strikes. We're just talking about close quarters fighting. So it's, I don't see how that the recent decisions have made any change, especially since you could see this coming. This was a growing crisis, and anybody who was watching was hearing about, oh, hey, even, just a few days ago, it's looking very dangerous. They're just about to close it. So this was going to happen, and now it's happening. We saw it happening, and even the Ukrainians themselves, I think there's a Ukrainian channel, Legitimy, said that, was talking about the Western reports. It's bunk. And they said, this crisis has been coming, and we saw it coming. Even the Ukrainians themselves are recognizing that. So we're seeing what we're seeing happening in Kursk has already happened in places like Avdiivka, in Ugledar, Kharkovo, very similar things, where the Ukrainians just stay there too long. And then the Russians just tightened the news to the point where they had no choice. They had to leave, but then it was already too late. They could not retreat in good order. And, many of them were killed trying to escape, in those places. And it looks like it's going to happen actually on a much larger scale in Kursk.
Should we expect a mass surrender?
I just saw a headline that there were some. I wouldn't be surprised.
Do you think there are many foreign mercenaries in Kursk?
There have been a lot of reports of foreign mercenaries with actual evidence supporting them, real Frenchmen and Brits and Americans and, others, Poles, unlike the North Koreans. Apparently, like the North Korean story seemed to be dropped for a while, and then it was revived and then dropped again.
I saw. Yeah.
But I just saw some story that claimed that like the North Koreans were marching on Suja or something, so...
Yeah, I saw that on MSNBC a couple of days ago as well. They're talking about the North Koreans, coming in.
Incredible, invisible North Koreans.
Right. Well, you were mentioning that, how this turned into a war of attrition with Russia. I'm wondering, that should have been apparent to everybody, right? That after the summer offensive of 2023, right? That this is all of a sudden we have changed into a war of attrition. And you don't want to get into a war of attrition with Russia on their border. It's so obvious when you are a country of 40 million against a country of 160 million that has infinite resources, and a war that they believe is existential. So when that was clear that this was a war of attrition, why weren't there more calls to say, okay, we had one shot, like you said, the U.S. military, Israeli military, it's built for these quick awe and shock campaigns, right? Shock and awe campaigns, not for these prolonged conflicts.
Right.
You don't want to get in a war of attrition with Russia. Anybody that's read a history book knows it always ends poorly.
Yeah.
So why? I guess I don't know if we want to answer that question. I've asked it so many times.
Yeah, right. Well, I think a lot of it goes down to bad leadership, and Zelensky is a deluded, incompetent military leader. He does not understand, what is needed to win a war, or at least to decrease your losses within a war. He's all about PR. I mean, that's what he comes out of. Remember, the guy was the star of the show, servant of the people, and then where he became president. And then he actually did become president. And I don't know if he's really managed to differentiate between the two, his role and his role before the cameras and his actual office of presidency. He is fixated on public relations, on the information war, and he's done very well. It seemed like it's rather overwhelming, especially in the first few months of the war. The Ukrainians just had, we found out a lot of it is because they were funded by USAID. They had all these propaganda outlets. They're just churning stuff out so fast, you just didn't know what's going on. and they just looked almighty and just incredible. And the Russians were just total incompetence. And the Russians just did a terrible job of explaining themselves. They don't even try, it seems. Yeah, I didn't really understand what the Russians were doing. Then
do you think that's a strategy though for them?
I don't
we just don't even. We're not going to say what we're not going to try to defend ourselves or try to tell.
I think I say, but didn't Putin? I think as you yourself mentioned recently in his interview with Tucker Carlson, says there's just no point in trying. They're so much better at this than we are. They're so much better at the information war. Yeah, but just over time, you started to understand. Oh, this is what the Russians are doing, and the thing is that again, reality. You can get kind of you can create this illusion, which is comforting for a while, but it's just not going to last. If the other side is constantly working on improving their real strength and pursuing a strategy that decreases your real strength, the outcome, of course, is inevitable. And no matter how much you've inflated your successes, in the end, you lose. I'm actually reminded of the space race during the 1960s, because of course, the Russians took an early lead in that, and Khrushchev was very excited about that, and he saw that he was getting a lot of mileage out of the Sputnik and Gagarin and these really amazing Soviet successes. So he continually pressured his space agency, to accelerate the process. We got to be the first to do this and the first to do that. And a lot of times, they were trying to tell him, say, it actually makes sense to do something that's kind of boring, but just will be the it's like the next rung on the ladder, that will allow us to do this spectacular thing later on. We have to be careful, we got to be realistic about this. And he didn't hear, so he was constantly pushing them to kind of, to make these, carry out these stunts. And it was to the detriment of the Soviet space program. And of course, they ended up losing the space race. Another reason is that the genius that ran the space program, the Soviet Union, he died. That's another factor. But again, I think it was the emphasis on short-term public relations stunts that contributed to the Soviet loss in the space race. And I think you see something similar that's happening in Ukraine. That again, Zelensky is very much like that. He's about, how I look on, what I can say in front of the cameras, what I can tell Western leaders when I meet them. And you can always lie about your losses. The thing is, like, what's on the map is hard to lie about because it can be verified through, satellite and drone photography. So if he can hold the line, like at Kursk, held it for a long time. Maybe it was at the expense of tens and tens of thousands of soldiers and thousands of armored vehicles, or at least many hundreds of armored vehicles. You can always lie about that and always claim that the other side is suffering greater losses, and they always seem to believe your lies. What you can't lie about is what's happening, where the front lines are. So we've had, you hear this, look, the front lines haven't moved all that much, and the Russians are suffering this horrific losses. So clearly the Ukrainians are doing quite well. He could at least pretend that. And but the problem, of course, with that strategy, you keep on sending in the reserves to plug the holes, and eventually you run out of the reserves, and then the holes are unplugged, and then it doesn't look good on the map anymore. It's just like you can't keep it alive forever.